On the transport plane were dangerous felons from around the world, but one prisoner stood out, his face completely concealed behind a heavy protective mask, his body locked in multiple sets of heavy minus-duty shackles, isolated in the aircraft's rear section. As the plane continued its flight, the man carefully worked at his restraint. Suddenly, the engine exploded violently. The aircraft shook violently. Prisoners desperately broke free from their restraints, lunging at the air marshals in the chaos, fighting for keys and weapons. The situation spiraled completely out of control. Meanwhile, a father and son watching the aurora in the snowy wilderness suddenly saw a burning boot fall from the sky, unaware that disaster was about to strike. While on the plane, the pilot desperately manipulated the controls, trying to stabilize the aircraft. By now, the masked man had broken free of his shackles and charged forward like a wild beast, instantly taking down an air marshal. The airborne riot was completely out of control. With only 600 meters to ground, the pilot adjusted the tail rudder, briefly stabilizing the fuselage. The plane finally crashed into the vast snow-covered forest. Some prisoners died on impact. Survivors stumbled through the snow trying to escape. Among them, a particularly conspicuous fierce-looking man with a thick beard. Deputy Chief Frank received a report from the fire department about massive black smoke rising from the northern mountain forest. He immediately led his team to the crash site, finding the aircraft buried in snow, surrounded by bodies and debris. During the search and rescue, Frank discovered a survivor. Suddenly, a group of prisoners charged out. A violent struggle erupted. Frank's colleague was stabbed and fell. Another was taken hostage. Frank remained calm, precisely shooting the knife-wielding prisoner and attempting to get his injured colleague back to the helicopter. But surrounded by the criminals, Frank had to fight alone. Eventually, he was overpowered and pinned to the ground. Just then, a blind air marshal picked up a handgun and killed the prisoner. Frank quickly got up, dealt with the remaining criminals, and sent his injured colleague up in the helicopter. At this moment, he didn't yet know he had stepped into an inescapable trap. Meanwhile, CIA headquarters also received the crash report. The director immediately recalled Agent Sidney because there was a special prisoner on board codenamed Hurley. Frank immediately assembled his team for deployment, ordering roadblocks at all valley exits and major highways to prevent prisoner escapes. He notified the hospital to enter level 1 emergency status, ready to receive casualties. Frank's wife worked at that hospital. Frank then learned it from the blind air marshal, Granger, that one prisoner on the plane had disrupted the transfer. That man had his face covered and was restrained. They called him Harlock. Soon, CIA agent Sidney arrived at the scene. When Frank asked why the transport had been rerouted to pick up a prisoner, Sidney initially refused to answer. But when Frank mentioned the codename Harlock, Sidney finally decided to reveal the truth. Sidney told Frank that Harlock was a false defector created by the CIA. Over the past 2 years, Harlock had used his information to draw out and eliminate multiple targets. Until a month ago, the false defector became a real one, taking classified intelligence with him. 2 days ago, Harlock was captured at the border. The prisoner transport flight provided a perfect opportunity to bring him to CIA headquarters. At that moment, a subordinate reported that the weather station had picked up an unencrypted signal from an observer, possibly a distress call, but the observation station was over 30 kilometers from the crash site. In sub-0 temperatures, reaching it seemed nearly impossible. However, Sidney believed that for Harlock, anything was possible. Frank led his police team through the blizzard to the station. Since the CIA had no law enforcement jurisdiction in Alaska, Frank insisted Sidney surrender his sidearm before entering. Inside the cabin, they began searching and found an old man tied up, but Harlock suddenly appeared from behind, taking down 2 officers. Outside, Sidney heard the commotion, grabbed an axe, and entered the room, but found no one. Suddenly, dogs barked outside. Everyone rushed out to see the prisoner holding a knife to the old man's throat. Frank wanted to negotiate for the hostage, but Sidney told him to shoot immediately. Seeing Frank hesitate, Sidney suddenly severed the guard dog's chain. The dog, desperate to save its master, lunged at the target. Within seconds, the man's throat was torn open, leaving him on the brink of death. Just as Frank wondered why Sidney had told him to shoot, he learned that this wasn't Harlock. Back at command, they received photos of all prisoners and air marshals from headquarters. Sidney compared them one by one and discovered that a corpse in prisoner uniform was actually Air Marshal Granger. Frank's mind immediately connected the dots. The blind air marshal who had saved his life wasn't an air marshal at all. He had put on the dead marshal's uniform, successfully impersonating him on evading capture. Thinking of his wife at the hospital, Frank called her, telling her to leave immediately. But at that moment, Harlock was already standing behind her. When Frank reached the hospital, both his wife and Harlock had vanished.